Hello, this is Christian with Dark Portents, and today I have a special guest on the channel, AP Canavan, or a Critical Dragon, and we're here to talk about the House of Chains. And this discussion will have no spoilers for the House of Chains. Or do you want to spoil the books before this, or should we be total non-spoilers and then we can go spoilers the rest of the way?
Well,
Go
hi
ahead.
Christian. Firstly, hello. Um, this is your channel, your video. You make up the rules. If you want to talk just about House of Chains, we can. If you want to start relating some of the stuff that happens in House of Chains backwards, we can do that. But um, it's entirely up to you. What do you want?
Let's just go as non-spoiler for the first three books as we can for this discussion, and then we'll go over to your channel and we can talk about the whole first four books if we want to, as they relate to House of Chains. So this is a book that I've been excited to talk about, and I've already discussed it at length over on Green Team with my co-panelists over there. But I'm excited to talk to you about it and to talk on YouTube about it because this is my favorite book that I've ever read, and I get the impression that that is not shared by a lot of the fandom of the Malazan series, particularly those that haven't gone through the series more than once. And I've only just read it for the first time, and it's my favorite book. So I want to get into maybe why it's my favorite book and also why
Well,
nobody likes it. That's
well,
harsh, you know.
it's very rare that I don't think I've ever heard someone say that House of Chains was their absolute favorite. But then again, I'm not heavily involved in the fandom. But um, what struck you about this book that you put it ahead of Dead House Gates or Gardens of the Moon or Memories of Ice?
So putting it ahead of Dead House Gates is tough because for me, I think, like, I know that I've seen Erickson talk about how this book is really a transitional book where it's trying to like kind of wrap up the arc that concluded in the first three books, but also like to sort of like push them towards what's going to happen in the next six books and introduce the new thing, the new elements, right? So I know that's what he intended with it because he said so, and I know that that may be a lot of why people don't like this book is because it there's so much setup it for what's going to happen in the next six books that the climax and conclusion of this sort of feel maybe anticlimactic, or it feels like, you know, one of my co-panelists called it narrative blue balls. Not that he felt it, but that it gives that feeling to some readers. And I get that, but for me, it I enjoyed it as a sequel to Dead House Gates. So in that sense, I feel like it really answered a lot of the trauma of Dead House Gates, a lot of the things that were built up in Dead House Gates found a resolution, some kind of an answer, be it a tragic one or in some cases a eucatastrophic one. I can't say that word. Eucatastrophic, the opposite of catastrophe. The
Well,
sudden positive
it's
right,
Tolkien's term.
right.
But let me put it to you this way. So obviously, one of the things that I've spoken about at length is reader expectation, and a lot of readers when they get faced with this series assume that you'll have book one, that story will be continued in book two, that story will be continued in book three, that story will be continued in book four, and so on. They assume a chronological sequence of events with a core set of characters. And you go, well, that's one way of doing a series. If you think of Ian M. Banks' culture novels, they're all part of the culture universe. They're all linked tangentially to each other. And you go, here's the first culture novel. Here's book two of the culture novels. But they don't follow on from each other. It's when you put them together, you get a sense of the wider universe of all of these things going on. So there are different ways to think about narrative structure. So if your expectation is that it's going to be a small core group of characters on a chronological quest sequence, read Wheel of Time. If that's what you want, don't expect this to be Wheel of Time. This is a different thing. It's a different series. And one of the ways of thinking about the Malazan Book of the Fallen is book one introduces the world and a whole sequence of events, and some of those particular elements are concluded in book three. And we've already read up to book four, so I'm just talking about it in very general terms. So book one and book three form a duology. Books two and book four form a duology. And those four things together form the first act of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is a 10-book volume or a 10-volume single story. So if we use a war analogy, and I've talked about this before, if books one and book three are about the North Africa campaign in World War II, and books two and book four are about aspects of the Eastern Front, and then books 5 and 6 or 5 and 7 introduce the Western Front, that we're talking about different aspects all coming together, that giving the reader a sequence and compartmentalized sections of this much, much bigger narrative that you only get the full sense of once you've completed it. But it's breaking it up into smaller chunks so that the reader can encounter them and understand them. And that will give you a sense of the broader narrative picture once you've finished the whole series. And then once you finish the series, you look back on the whole thing and you can actually recontextualize everything. So this idea that it has to be a single narrative all the way through is a reader expectation that is built essentially on a faulty premise, because none of the books have promised that. That is an expectation the readers had going in based on what they have read in something else. So book one, book three linked together as a duology. Book two and book four linked together as a duology. And both 1, 2, 3, and 4 have elements that will tie into what happens in the rest of the series. So it's about different ways of thinking of the narrative. It's not necessarily that, oh, it should do this or it should do that. It's look at what it is actually doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so back to sort of your question of why I put it higher than Dead House Gates. That is not an easy decision, because without Dead House Gates, a lot of House of Chains wouldn't have the same impact for me. And so it's, really they're together. And you have all the buildup in Dead House Gates. Not that there was no resolution or no release there, but then all of those things sort of get, or many of them at least, get resolved here. So you get I feel the payoff of Dead House Gates in House of Chains, and I liked that payoff. Also, as far as over the top D&D, out there alien stuff, this book has upped the ante even farther than the others. And I don't want to get too spoilery, right? We can talk about it more in the next video, but there's some stuff in here that just the D&D player in me was like, oh my god, he did that, and he did that, and it's so cool. Doing some of the stuff with even time and with not just without sticking to only this one world that most of the books takes place on. You get some stuff with aliens and a sense of creatures from different worlds in this book that was there in the first 3 books, but it was just on such a higher level in this book, and it I just enjoy that a lot.
And that's, every reader has their own experience and their own way of interpreting the text, and we all have different things that we like and don't like. And your co-host with the slightly gendered term to describe the conclusion of House of Chains.
They didn't describe that for themselves. They just said this is what a lot of readers, they get the expectation and then they get the blue balls from the quote unquote blue balls from the
But and part of that again, it's this expectation about things should be resolved in a certain way. And I actually have Erickson and I sat down and we went through the ending scene of House of Chains, and we took it all apart to show exactly what he was doing and how he was doing it. And when you see that, you go, but this is narrative closure. This is an effective ending. This is concluding the narrative in what can be a very satisfying way. What happens is if we expect that, oh, it's going to build to this thing, then when that thing doesn't happen, it's, oh, well, that's not what I wanted. And we get into, do we want reader subversion? Do we want something ending the same way every single time that we read a book? Do we want it to end in different ways? If it's ending in a different way, this is exactly what we asked for, but it's not the way that we wanted. So, it doesn't, you don't have to read the end of House of Chains and go, oh yeah, this was absolutely brilliant. It will work for some people, it won't for others.
right.
But
Well, and I think interestingly, there seems to be like a few endings of different plot lines at the end of House of Chains that like reader expectations interact with each of them differently. And so like the one where I feel like expectations were most subverted seemed to be the one that readers were like, oh no, that part was fine. But then they didn't like the one where I was like, that's exactly how I expected this to end from the beginning. And I think that came down to they didn't like the character from Dead House Gates that one of the endings was about. So many readers, I feel, don't react well to that character, and that kind of colors whether they care about the resolution for them, right? And for me, I feel like I read Dead House Gates for the first time and I absolutely hated it. I hated Gardens of the Moon. I hated Dead House Gates. I wanted the books to be thinking for me. I'd just come off of Wheel of Time. I had my expectations and it wasn't working. I wanted to get it and I didn't get it. And going back and rereading them, I was like, oh, this is so amazing. How did I ever hate this? And so I immediately, after getting to like chapters 5 of Memories of Ice, realized I need to do this on this podcast with these other 3 guys that are about to do this, and restarted it. So I've read Dead House Gates 3 times at this point, which certainly changes, I feel, the impact of not getting the end of that for so long and going through it so many times. And then you finally get the release of the ending. It might be a lot different of an experience for somebody who read Dead House Gates once and then gets to House of Chains,
Yeah, but you have to remember, one of the very strange things about all of this is, back when these were first released, you bought the book, you read the book, and then you waited.
Right.
And you waited. And you waited. And then new book is out, you buy the book and you read the book, and then you waited. And you waited. Whereas now, people can go out and they can get the 10, I bought all 10 books and I can just read them one after the other. And they can binge it if they wanted to. And it's
not a series very suited for binging, though.
Well,
it feels like one you want to sit with and just ruminate in it and like live in it for a long time. Take your time.
But this is what I was about to get to, which is when these books were coming out, when they were being released, you had that time in between books to think about the book, to think about it in connection to the previous book, to leaf back through it, to have a look at different passages, to see if you could put some of the things together, maybe reread sections of it.
Yeah, if I had been reading this as it came out, I would have reread the series every time a new book came out. That's what I did for Wheel of Time. Of course, they were a lot longer in between the Wheel of Time books. These came out every year once the first one got published. The Malazan books did. So maybe not. Maybe I would have done a couple rereads, but that was the kind of reader I was at the time that these were coming out.
Yeah, and so, but the reading experience back then was actually quite different. And then, obviously, with the advent of internet forum and Discord and YouTube videos and all of these different ways for fans to interact, suddenly there was. I was reading this book, and you went to the forum, and then there was a wiki had been developed, and it changed the reading experience quite dramatically, because instead of rereading sections of the book and thinking about it, you just looked at the wiki, and or you went on to Discord and you sat and you chatted to people. And again, it's a perfectly valid, it's the new way that people read, but it is different to that original sort of way that it was coming out and the way that people originally interacted with it.
Well, you know
And
what? It's interesting that you say that, because the first time I tried to read Malazan, I had no interaction with anybody. I wasn't about the book. I wasn't looking at the internet about it. I mean, it wasn't at the time of release, but it was earlier. Like, we did have the internet, but it wasn't so, networked where, like, oh, I'm going to read this and then I'm going to talk about what I just read to 5 other people that are reading the book. Unless you had a book club or something, there wasn't, at least I had no access to that kind of feedback at the time. And so all I had is, I've just finished Wheel of Time. People recommend this book as where I should go next. And having only read this more like hero's journey quest type fantasy, I was just like, what is this? I hate it. And, after many years of learning more about philosophy and film and reading more complex fantasy, going back to it, the first book was still a little bit of a struggle, but what did I use to help me through the struggle? 2 things. One was the PowerPoint presentation guide for Gardens of the Moon. After every chapter, I would go look at the PowerPoint. And did I actually understand that? Oh, I did. I had that right. Did I understand that? No, I had that wrong. I totally missed it. And that helped me get into the world to where once I got to Dead House Gates, I didn't need it. But and the other thing was the 10 Very Big Books podcast, which now there are better podcasts like the Duke and Duchess go through every chapter of Gardens of the Moon. And I like that a lot better than 10 Very Big Books personally. But that helped me. 10 Very Big Books helped me through book 1 as well, where I read it, maybe I understood some of it, maybe not. And I go back and I hear them talk about it and I'm like, oh, so I did get that right. Oh, I got that wrong. And that really helped helped me understand it.
That is a bizarre, to me, that is a bizarre way to read a book. I have never in my life done that.
By the way, to me too, I've never done it. And now that I'm comfortable in the Malazan world, I don't do it. But it helped me through the initial hurdle. I've never done it with any other book besides Gardens of the Moon, to be clear.
This is something I genuinely find like it's very alien to me, because I read a book and I don't stop after chapter and go, I wonder, like, I don't really I read the book, like I finish the book, and then I go, does it all make sense? Yeah, okay. And I can go back through and have a look at various bits and pieces. I would never think to stop after 1 chapter or 3 chapters to go, I need someone to explain what happened in the chapter to me, or I want to check that I've understood this chapter right. I go, no, I'll wait until I've finished it. Because if you're watching...
well, I've already finished it before.
But if you're watching, if you were watching a film, let's say you're watching Top Gun or Predator, classic 80s action movie, Predator, not exactly a complex narrative. But in it, if you stopped after, oh, well, who are these guys? Hang on, let me pause the film here. After this whole first sequence, I'm going to pause the film and I go and look up online a breakdown of this sequence for all the things I'm meant to have gotten from it. That's not how you would approach watching a film. You'd watch the film and then you go, I don't get some of that. Then maybe you'd go and look at it. This idea of stopping after chapters where you haven't finished the narrative, where you haven't gotten all of the information that the author was going to be giving you.
Well, in this case, I had already, though. I'd already read the book once. So, it's the second read. and it's trying to get into, it's trying to the world, the writing in Gardens of the Moon is so different from most of fantasy. It's so packed with meaning and subtext and depth that it's a lot to learn how to read it and get everything from it for a casual reader to go into the kind of reading that Malazan rewards is a transition. I mean, it only took me one book, to do it, but that first book, I needed the help. I needed something. I either needed people to talk to about it, people to listen to about it, something to help me like process it. It's just so much.
And that to me was it's one of the reasons why Gardens of the Moon remains one of my favorite books. And I know we're meant to be talking about House of Chains, but Gardens of the Moon remains one of my favorite books because it was, I think, the first in my experience of reading a lot of fantasy that I went, wow, this is genuinely doing something different. It was the combination of the complex and intricate prose, the symbolism and themes that were woven seamlessly throughout the whole thing, that the world itself wasn't a generic fantasy land. It wasn't a pseudo medieval European setting with barbarian Viking invaders in the north and your sort of Renaissance kind of Latinate nobles to the south. It did away with all of that and was actually a very fresh setting, and it was a different style, and it did things differently. And when I first picked it up, and I've told this story before, when I first picked it up, I must have read maybe the first 50 pages and went, I'm not in the mood for this. The second time I picked it up, I think I got to about 150 pages and went, I need to actually sit down when I have time to read this properly. And it was the third time that I picked it up. I read it and went, okay, this is something different. This is something new. Because, I had a lot of those same reader expectations. And combating that reflex, almost like that muscle memory, that when you start reading or when you start watching something, the muscle memory of, I know how this genre functions, or I know how narrative functions. And oh, it didn't do that. Where did that come from? Why isn't it doing the thing that I expected to do? I'm uncomfortable. That is muscle memory built into us about the things that we read, about the narratives we consume.
And in this case, the thing that I expected most for the book to do, that I'm now so glad that it doesn't do, is have fish out of water character that things are explained to, so that the reader understands what's going on around them. I'm so glad it doesn't. It's so much fun digging into the subtext and the conversations between the different characters, and trying to glean like what character motivations are out of like what they say, what they think, what they do, and how those things like contradict with or go along with each other. Like, it's a lot of fun, but I was not prepared for that. Like, I was like, why don't I understand this? I think I reread the first couple chapters like quite a few times my first time through, because I was like, what does she mean it's that obvious? I don't know if you know what I'm referring to here, but there's a scene where two of the characters in Gardens of the Moon are talking to each other. We'll eventually talk about House of Chains, but they're talking to each other, and one of the characters is like, oh, this happened at the same time that happened, and the other character's like, oh, it's that obvious, is it? And I reread those chapters like so many times to figure out what those characters meant. I eventually got it, well, probably before most readers do, because I was expecting the text to tell me what everything means and to not leave me confused constantly, right? So I was like beating my head against the text like to tell me its secrets, instead of just meeting it where it is, and accepting that things will be a little confusing for a while, and just get what you can out of it.
But people, this is a weird thing, and again, people always refer to it as confusing, and I honestly don't think it's confusing. I think a lot of information is withheld from the reader because it's written in a tight, focalized, subjective perspective. And if you think of conversation, say like a conversation that you and I have, there's a lot implied in that because we don't explain everything to each other because we're talking in a world where there are a whole lot of base assumptions. So we don't explain things to each other. We talk in sometimes in fragments. We don't talk in full sentences. We
Right.
don't begin, well, I am now going to explain this thing. And as you well know, the empire was founded 100 years ago by, that doesn't happen.
Right.
And so when we have the dialogue in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, a lot of the dialogue is actually intensely naturalistic. It follows the patterns and style of how we discuss things in the real world.
Yes.
Actual conversational patterns.
Yes.
And we're not used to that in narrative. Narrative, because it is an artificial form, it's an art form, but narrative is quite artificial. So we're used to a certain element of artificiality in how dialogue is created to feed the information to the reader via dialogue, i.e. info dumping through dialogue exposition. We're used to that. That is a technique in narrative. And if someone goes for a more naturalistic style, a lot of that, they still have to include that information and they will piece it out over time. They will imply things. They will show you the almost like
Hello.
the negatives. Hello?
Oh, you jumped for a second. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh. But in dialogue, sometimes it creates a negative space where the concept is. And as the dialogue progresses, suddenly you realize the thing they are not talking about. Or later on in the book, someone will say something and it will trigger your memory of that conversation. You go, that's the thing that they were talking around.
Right. Right.
And it's one of these styles of narrative that is not as common in fantasy writing as it is in other genres.
Right. It gets easier once you become practiced at it. After the first book, it becomes easier to and more fun to try to figure out what's in that negative space and to try to figure out what's being implied or not being said. And in Memories of Ice, I don't know if Erickson did this on purpose to annoy us or as a response to like people's criticisms or what, but there are a lot of the early dialogue and internal monologues are less naturalistic at the beginning of Memories of Ice. And you get like Quickman thinking things overtly to himself or saying things out loud that he wouldn't say because he already knows those things. And I feel like if it's intentional, it's brilliant because it's like, see how I could write this? Wouldn't that just be annoying?
Well, I think part of it is, like any stylistic choice, not 100% of a narrative is going to be 100% that to its absolute extreme. It's always a movement between the different positions. So for instance, like show don't tell, this big aphorism that people use and they throw around, and that is the guiding principle of a lot of Erickson's writing. Does he always apply it absolutely to the extreme in every single instance? No, because that'd be incredibly difficult to read and probably not very enjoyable. So it's always a movement between showing and telling. It is every single book is a movement between showing and telling. Every author goes more to one side, more to the other for certain sequences. With I think in Memories of Ice, there some of the exposition is more overt. It is an easing of the style to make it easier for the reader. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, stylistically, he's moved slightly closer to tell than the previous stance with just a lot of it being show, but it's still not overt info dumping. It's not long passages of someone explaining everything in the text to you. That's not what happens.
Not even
quite a lot of it is framed with subtextual information embedded into a description. Or you were talking about Quickben thinking things through in his head. well, sometimes we do that. Sometimes we think through things that we kind of already know because we're trying to piece it all together. It still stylistically fits with this naturalistic, limited perspective that Erikson employs. Is it slightly more forgiving to the reader? Yeah. And generally that's a good thing for a lot of readers. It makes it more accessible. It makes it less difficult. But a big factor in all of this is the more you are used to that particular style, the more you extract from the style. And because of that, things that if you started with Memories of Ice, you go, I still don't get it. Someone who's read the first two books goes, what do you mean you don't get it? It's this thing. Because now you're actually so used to it that these things feel overt when they are still relatively covert. And we see an extension of that into House of Chains.
Right. Yeah. And House of Chains, speaking of the use of naturalistic dialogue and viewpoint to show and not show and tell and not tell things to the reader, it opens with a very interesting first quarter of the book. We have, for the first time, Erikson sticks to one point of view, although he does do a couple scenes in this where he has just a camera on other characters that point of view doesn't get. But as far as like assuming a viewpoint, he assumes one character's point of view, and it's throughout the entire first like 200 pages or something of the novel. So that was an interesting decision to just drop that into the middle of this ongoing multi-POV series.
And people talk about this, and frequently gets brought up that Erikson had done this as a writing experiment because people say, "Oh, he can't write a single POV," and you go, "Well, clearly he can," because if you think the multiple POVs that he've used throughout all of the things, well, if you just strung them all together, it would be a single POV. The whole idea of someone can't do something. Of course, authors can do it that way. They choose multiple POVs for particular reasons. But for a reader of Malazan, where you've had the first three books that have these multiple POVs, again, it's the Erikson doing something to subvert expectations, to provide something new, to show that the series isn't stale. It isn't following the same patterns again and again and again. It's trying to do different things. It's experimenting with different narrative forms so that every book feels different, instead of feeling that, oh, well, this is, I know exactly what's going to happen because I've read book 1, 2, and 3. I know book 4 is going to introduce these things. It's going to resolve them in the same way, but it'll have different window dressing or different superficial detail. None of Erikson's books in the Malazan Book of the Fallen feel the same. They're all unique, which is actually, again, very refreshing in a genre that likes its formulas, that likes its structures, that this is something new. And it is one of the reasons why the series is so divisive, because there isn't that thing that you fall into that if you liked books 1, 2, and 3, you're going to like the rest of the series because it's going to follow the same things. The Malazan Book of the Fallen is going to be divisive because every book is different.
Yeah, they are. I mean, there is, you can find like similarities maybe between 1 and 3 or between 2 and 4, because they're on the same location, they're in the same theater, and there are some of similar themes even explored between 2 and 4, but they don't feel the same.
But the structure of 2 does not match the structure of 4.
Right.
The resolution of 2 does not match the resolution of 4. The resolution of 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all different. They all happen in different ways. They all emphasize different things. They're all told in different ways. The structures of all of them are different. That the only sort of reason why we sort of go, oh, that one's like that one, 2 and 4, is, well, okay, so they're on the same continent. And they have recurring characters.
I would say that
the story being told is different.
I would say that for 2 and 4, there's also a similar feeling of catharsis at the ending.
a lot a lot of the books have catharsis as the form of closure, or a different form of closure. Closure being one of these things, just of the resolution of a novel, and catharsis you typically have with tragedy. Uh, at least a lot of the tragedies that we remember. Um, and that's interesting because books 1 and 2 didn't really have, well, book 1 not cathartic, book 2 heavily emotional, and a
Yes.
lot of that is about frustrated quest and frustrated journey, and about failure or pyrrhic victory, that these things are all undercut instead of a traditional resolution of ta da ta da,
Right.
we've won. That's not what happens. Book 3, I would maintain, is probably the closest to the expected narrative paradigm of an epic fantasy. It really does fit with that feel of traditional epic fantasy that we find within the genre.
But
That's
it still plays with some of your expectations, even
oh,
within that paradigm.
yeah, because Erickson can't help himself. He's sneaky. But again, and then book 4 is again trying to do something different. So it's one of the reasons why this remains one of my favorite series, one of my most engaged series, one of the ones that challenges me and makes me rethink about things. It is such a flexible series, and it does so many different things in different ways. It's really engaging, whereas a lot of other fantasy series or fantasy stories, when you've read them, when you know what the narrative events are, you go, that was a really well told story. It was highly enjoyable. I'll now go and get a different series. There's something about the depth of the Malazan Book of the Fallen that keeps you coming back to re-examine things, to think about things in a different light, when you suddenly emphasize one aspect or one character and re-look at the narrative created from that character perspective, and it makes it look different. Whereas, you don't typically have a lot of that in a lot of fantasy writing.
Right. Right. The closest thing I could maybe see is seeing all seeing all the foreshadowing that's there throughout the 3 books in without spoilers, in the first Law trilogy, when you go back through after you know what the twist is, and seeing like, oh, this was here all along. The author beat me over the head with it and I wouldn't see it because of my expectations. but
And
but
and
it's not the same level of depth probably as Malazan, for sure.
and and Abercrombie is a great writer. Like, I mean, I think his works are exceptional as well. But and one of the weird things about foreshadowing, you can have very overt foreshadowing where they talk about, is it Chekhov's gun, the gun on the mantelpiece in the first act, then you have to use it by the end. That's very overt foreshadowing. But there are other things that obviously you only realize in retrospect were signaling all of these things. And if you think of any of those mystery movies, or any of those movies with a twist at the end, when the twist is revealed, and then the movie does a montage of all of those sequences to re-show you the key moments with the new information. That's why they do it. But obviously, you can do it much faster in a film than you can do in a novel, which took you X number of hours or days or weeks to read. But it's the same technique. It's a revelation at the end, which makes you rethink the narrative. And when you have a 10-book series like Malazan, and I admit, this is one of the most frustrating things about doing videos about Malazan books, is the reason people say you have to read and find out, or you don't quite get this yet. There is a reveal at the end that, when you go back to the very beginning and recontextualize the whole thing, changes the entire narrative. And it's incredibly frustrating because you don't want to spoil that for people. You don't want to spoil that reveal. But it changed. So people, when they complain about certain things in a book, and you go, you say that now, but once you've read the end, you know what the reveal is, and then you go back to this and you reread it with knowing that piece of information. This will take on a different meaning. And when people say read and find out, or when people sort of say um don't get worried about that, or you're reading that the wrong way, they are desperately trying not to tell you what the end is that reframes it. They're actually trying to be nice and not spoil the end of a 10-book series. But yeah, you want to say to people, you've completely misread that, because this piece of information, like at the end of a mystery movie, that recontextualizes everything, is really important here.
Right. So did you enjoy Erickson's experiment with the single point of view
Oh
at the
yeah.
beginning of this? Yeah.
It, like I said, so there's a lot of narrative variety within the Malazan Book of the Fall, and this was another part of that. And yeah, it was different. It was and going through it the first time was very refreshing to suddenly have a long stretch of narrative that had that sense of continuity and cohesion and building towards something. And of course, the revelation about who that character is. And you go, oh,
I didn't get to experience that.
oh. But
Because somebody was talking to me and they were like, oh, this one sentence description of the character. And I think they didn't realize that I only had like maybe 2 words out of the one sentence so far. So the one sentence was enough to put it together and go, it's that guy.
but you know, again, and you can piece it together before the big reveal in the text.
Sure,
you know,
but I don't know when I would have. I'm deprived of knowing when I would have pieced it together.
but again, I mean, that's such a small thing, because it's more about the, oh, so that's how this fits into that, and that's how this connects to that.
Sure.
And suddenly, what had seemed disparate, what had seemed discontiguous, what had seemed separated from the rest of it, you go, actually, this is a piece I didn't know we were missing from the puzzle. And then when you think of what that means then for other characters, so not the character explored here, but other characters where you go, they all have backstories and they all have these things that they are bringing. And that can explain a lot of the pieces that we may not have yet. And as you go through the series, as more things get revealed, because obviously in Memories of Ice, we find out a lot more about what happened in Gardens of the Moon. It recontextualizes Gardens of the Moon. House of Chains recontextualizes a lot of what happened in Deadhouse Gates. And there's movement between those two things about why certain things happened. So complaints that people had in Gardens of the Moon and Deadhouse Gates going, this is blah, 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 and they were getting really annoyed and really frustrated. And then in this book, it's like, yeah, but that's that thing. And you
I
either
never know, when I'm recommending the series to people, I never know how much to not say or to say about stuff like that. I just gave my sister Gardens of the Moon. And one of the things I was like, she was like, oh, I'm going to read chapter 1 on such and such day. I was like, okay, the big battle for the series is in chapter 2. You're going to be piecing that together for the next 3 books. Don't worry if you don't get it all.
but no, if do you remember there was a Steven Spielberg did a miniseries called Band of Brothers, and Band of Brothers starts out following Easy Company as they, I think it starts out with them training, and then as they get deployed into World War II. And then halfway through the series, suddenly they're in a different thing, because you know nothing was happening with that sort of group. And then when they come back, one of the characters is now off doing something else. He got promoted. He's now in charge of that thing. It's in terms of expected narrative, it's a fractured narrative. It's focusing on all of these different bits and pieces. But you wouldn't say to someone going to watch Band of Brothers right now, you have to remember that you don't explain it. You go, just watch it. It's a really interesting World War II series. Just experience what it's doing, and don't get frustrated when you're not following your favorite character. Follow it because it's a story about World War II, and your initial entry is with these people.
Right.
So, you know, if I was recommending Gardens of the Moon, as I have done to people, I say, listen, it's a fantasy book, but don't go into it expecting certain narrative techniques or certain narrative structures, or just read the book in front of you. Read it, get to the end, then think about it. If you sort of still don't understand it, ask yourself, how much of it do you need to understand? Do you actually need every single little thing explained to you? Because if you do, this is not the series for you. This is not something you're going to enjoy. If you need everything laid out in that particular style, then you're not going to enjoy this. Why force yourself through 10 books of a style you're not going to like? That seems counterintuitive to me.
Sure.
But if you want to engage with something different, that something, an author in fantasy has written a complete 10-book series that thematically, structurally, in terms of world building, everything is linked. Everything works together. All of the pieces fit. And then when you think that there's another author who was writing in exactly the same world, and some of the plot threads and some of the characters from that 10-book series actually are characters and plot threads that are continued, resolved, or came from the other series. That's not a companion series. It's a completely different series. It just happens to be set in the same world. It's an amazing literary experiment. And
that actually contributed to my enjoyment of House of Chains. So I was reading Dead House Landing alongside House of Chains because I have to read these Book of the Fallen on a schedule for recording. I can't just read ahead. I could, but then I'd have to reread the sections for the recording, and then I wouldn't get to speculate freely because I'd know the things I'd be speculating on. So I choose to only read what we're recording for, which means I have a lot more time to read a lot of other things than Book of the Fallen. So I've been reading some of the Esselmont stuff, when it's not going to spoiler the Book of the Fallen too much. And I would read in House of Chains them talking about the events, and then like the next day I would read about those events as they're happening from the other author in Dead House Landing, which was very cool. Like it was like I read it at exactly the right moment. I'd already gotten it, told from the perspective of somebody talking like 100 years later about it just the day before, and then I read about it how the people 100 years earlier saw it and did it. And that was just a really fun way to experience both House of Chains and Dead House Landing. They complemented each other so well, completely not on purpose. Like nobody said, oh, you should read these two together. It just happened to be what I was reading, and it was just perfect. The other thing, though, that really helped me get into and enjoy House of Chains is this initial single POV. And then when you get to the first chapter that brings you back into the full world with the full cast of characters, it's like you were fasting, and then somebody's like, here's the best steak dinner with the perfectly matched wine and the best potatoes or whatever you're going to eat with your steak dinner, and here it all is, the full course meal with the wine and everything. And after fasting, your mouth just waters, and not that I fast very often, but I understand the concept of the first big meal afterwards. And that's what that chapter felt like, was like, oh, we're coming home to this style of storytelling again. And it was a beautiful feeling.
Yeah, and I know that some people, when they get to that transition section, they suddenly go, oh, I was actually really enjoying the streamlined, much more chronologically organized, straightforward.
Oh, I did enjoy that. I wasn't trying to knock that at all.
I know,
by saying that.
but when they get to that section where it sort of reverts to the multiple points of view, and then the story threads again being slightly disparate and weaving together and in and out and referring back to each other, they went, but I was preferring the more straightforward approach. And you go, well, okay, you've now identified a style of storytelling that you like a lot more. There are loads of fantasy books out there that use that style. So that is actually really useful information to go, That's the style I like. It's not that you really enjoyed the character, it's the style of narrative. So you can actually go out and look for other fantasy series that use that structure or that point of view and go, I'm going to read those ones now because that's going to scratch that itch for me.
Although, in addition to the style, that character was just a lot of fun to read, especially because you get the initial discomfort of Erickson maybe suggesting that he's not a fun guy and you maybe shouldn't like him. And then you get to see him go through quite a bit of growth in that little first section.
And again, like, inclusion is not the same as endorsement. The inclusion of a character doing things is not the same as endorsing those things.
Oh, sure. I mean, it didn't feel like endorsement at all. It felt like
but
it felt like Erickson was almost saying this character's a bad guy. And then you get to see the character like learn more about the world and learn more about like his deficiencies and how he responds to that. And sometimes it's through this cognitive dissonance and refusal to change, but sometimes it's through incorporating things. And it's a very interesting journey to see you go through.
And certainly, I mean, like, obviously, one of the traps that we fall into is we use very simplistic terms: good guy, bad guy, hero and villain. And a lot of what gets explored in House of Chains, very particularly, is this idea that people are more complicated than that. You know, when we saw in Star Wars, like, Darth Vader arriving, you go, he's the bad guy, like, he's the villain, and the Empire are clearly villainous. Imagine how Star Wars would have been different if, in that very first film with Luke Skywalker and Han Solo and Princess Leia, that one of the narrative perspectives had been a couple of the stormtroopers going about their jobs on the Death Star. And how that would have changed the ending of that film if you understood that they were just doing their job. They've been forced into this position, and they were worried about their wife and their kids at home, and it would change the tone of the film. So imagine now an entire series of a fantasy world where some of the characters that, if it was always told from the heroic perspective, you'd be going, bad guy, bad guy, bad guy. But now when you follow them and you invest in them and you understand their backstory, it reveals that complexity of the human condition. We are not all paragons of virtue. I don't think there's a single character in the Malazan Book of the Fallen is 100% good. And there are very few characters that you would say are 100% bad. There are characters who are absolutely loathsome. But
although you do get maybe your most villainous characters so far in this particular book, there are a couple of them that the author does not seem to sympathize with their with their viewpoint or with their actions, and that seem a little more villainous maybe than other characters that we've seen as antagonists in the series so far.
Certainly, at least one of them chokes on the ending.
Yes, that's one of the ones I was referring to. And the other one has blue skin.
But we can talk more about that in the spoiler thing.
Sure.
But is there anything else that you wanted to chat about, just non-spoilery, as we're sitting here?
Sure. No, not really. I have some more thoughts, but I think they might all be spoilery. Do you have anything else you wanted to bring up?
No, I mean, there's always more you can talk about. There's always stuff that we don't discuss, and sometimes it's because it fits better when you can actually add in the detail. But and even then, you always run out of time. And in about half an hour's time, I'll go, oh, why didn't I mention that thing, and that thing?
Oh yeah.
But like House of Chains, it's an absolutely fascinating novel. I love the ending to it, and I liked a lot of the change of style and pace and things that were going on, but how structurally we saw the conclusion of one military arc in the earlier books, and now we see the birthing of a new military band. And I think there's an interesting aspect of the closure of old legends and the starting of new legends that happens in this.
Yes.
And I think that's a very interesting dynamic that works its way in thematically.
And I think that also might hit on uh, one of the problems that people who are going through the series for the first time have with this book is that they want to spend a lot more time with the military, because one of the attractive aspects of Malazan for a lot of people is like how much time you spend with like common soldiers, and you get the themes of found family and camaraderie, and sort of you get to know like how these soldiers work together and relate to the command structure and all of this. And this book feels like it promises a lot of that, and what you get of the soldiers is really fun and really interesting, and you get to know a few of these characters a little bit, but it doesn't maybe deliver as much of the military fantasy as previous books did, and presumably as the future books will. And so that's a little bit of like that, like the itch you get to scratch it just a little bit, but maybe it's still itching, and they want more of that, but we get more of things from different perspectives, which I loved, but
Yeah, and again, it's about, remember that Erickson wasn't writing for one reader. Well, right. Erickson was actually writing for one reader.
He was Esselmont.
Ian C. Esselmont.
Yeah.
But when we think about why didn't Erickson do more of this and less of that? Because I would have enjoyed it a lot more. And you go, well, he didn't know you, and he wasn't writing the book for you.
Right.
Sure. Because the person sitting next to you who's read the same book goes, well, no, the thing that you liked, I didn't like. And the thing that you hated was the thing that I absolutely loved.
Right.
There's a huge audience out there. There's a huge audience of readers with very different expectations. And what I think every author hopes for is for their work to find an audience that is interested in the story being told. Not, and some authors maybe do this. They go, I am going to write a military fantasy to appeal to military fantasy fans. Some people may be doing that. Other people might say, I want to write a fantasy story and I want to send it out into the world to see if there are readers out there who want to read my fantasy story.
Well, Erickson has created a military fantasy fan. That's me. I didn't know I was a military fantasy fan until I read Malazan, and now I'm like, can we get more of this? More fantasy about soldiers, not warriors? Where do I find it? And there's not nothing, but it's relatively thin on the ground.
Glenn Cook's Black Company.
Sure.
Hang on a sec. Paul Hoffman's trilogy. There's the Macht trilogy, Macht trilogy. That's all quite Spartan-esque. There's a lot of historical fantasy based in and around the Spartans, the Greeks, the Romans. Loads of stuff like that. Sorry, this was just, I didn't know you were going to ask about that, and I'm just trying to think of other ones off the top of my head.
Well, maybe you could send me an email with a list of recommendations so we don't stall our video here trying to, but I'll definitely check those out. But if you think of any others, shoot me an email or Twitter or something.
Okay then. So will we move on to spoilers then?
Yeah, let's go ahead and stop the recording. So this has been Dark Portents with special guest AP Canavan, or A Critical Dragon. And if you want to see our spoiler-filled discussion of House of Chains, hop on over to his channel. I'll throw the link in the description. If you like the discussion and you want to hear more, like, comment, subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. Dark Portents signing out.